Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Steady as she goes, Russia continues to pursue a carefully calibrated policy of force and diplomacy regarding Syria. Damascus invited Moscow to enter the conflict to preserve the state and fight terrorism. In the meantime, Washington and its allies remain clueless. To Crosstalk Syria, I'm joined by my guest, Mohammed Marandi in Tehran. He is an associate professor at the University of Tehran. In Brighton, we have Catherine Shakdam. She is the director of the Shafakna Institute for Middle Eastern Studies and author of the book Arabia's Rising. And in Philadelphia, we cross to Greg Roman. He is the director of the Middle East Forum. All right, Crosstalk rules. In effect, that means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Catherine, if I can go to you first, in Brighton, after 4.5 years of civil war and after 1 month, a little more than a month of Russia's bombing campaign, at the invitation, I need to stress, of the Damascus government, there's more talk about diplomacy now probably than ever before. Are you optimistic that now the players that are going to be around the table, including Iran, that I'd like to point out, that we can finally put an end to this civil war?
I would say yes, I'm optimistic in that we have all the right actors sitting around the same table trying to find a way forward for peace for Syria. And they're not trying to impose anything on Syria. They're really just trying to discuss things for Syria and act really, I would say, as peace broker. Not so much as there's no diktat coming from Moscow or Iran. So it's really just a case of trying to frame a conversation so that Syria would be able to move forward towards peace. And I think that's very important because up until now, I think that the Americans have tried to impose, their political will and their own agenda on the region, whereas Russia is really just trying to work with Syria and alongside Syria, which is, what international would require Russia to do, as opposed to trying to impose their will. So I think that's very important, yes. Okay,
Greg in Philadelphia, would you agree or disagree with what we just heard from Brighton? Go ahead.
I would completely disagree with the professor's statements. What we're looking at right now is not a fight for territorial continuity within the Syrian government ruled by Damascus, but 5 separate internecine conflicts. And Russia's only involved in one of the 5 wars that are going on right now in the region that we used to call Syria. If we go back to Sykes-Picot in 1920, which established the modern Syrian state, and then look all the way to today, we see a fragmentation of different peoples, whether it be Sunnis, Shias, Alawis, Kurds, Yazidis, whatever you want to talk about. And I think we have to be a lot more nuanced and also look at the support for Russian, basically support of a genocidal actor in Syria itself.
Okay. Professor Marandi, would you like to jump in there? I mean, we have to remember that Russia's goals are pretty simple. International law, the preservation of a sovereign state, and fighting terrorism. Those are the 3. And it's pretty simple, at least from where I'm standing here. Professor Marandi, go ahead and jump in.
Well, I'm not sure. I think that there is a lot that remains to be done. The United States continues to support militant militias, militant groups that are allied with extremists. The United States knows that its allies are funding Al-Qaeda in Syria, such as the Nusra Front and Jund al-Sham. The United States knows that Turkey continues to work with ISIL, and of course the Saudi regime is bombarding civilians and killing people across Yemen and working with Al-Qaeda there as well. So we still don't see a shift in policy in the United States in its support for extremist groups. And the Iranians believe that until the support for the extremists and until those countries that have created this civil war and have all this blood on their hands, which includes the American and British and French governments, as well as neighbors of Syria, the Iranians believe that this will not end, and the Iranians will continue to support the Syrian government until they're able to regain the ground that has been lost to the extremists, and that includes President Assad.
Okay, Catherine, do you see that the U.S. is going to change gears at all? Because it continues to call for regime change in one form or another. They say the timeline's different, so I think that's just kind of doublespeak. But it's not changing its position about supporting these extremist groups in Syria, because all they've done in the last few weeks and months is rebrand these terrorist groups into different names. Now there's this Democratic Front or something like that's popped up in the last few days here It's a rebranding issue that it doesn't actually change the facts on the ground, except for that Russia might be find them and bomb them to smithereens, which would not be a bad idea. Go ahead, Catherine.
Well, I mean, there's a problem here, and I think that the main problem is that America has continued to understand Russia's intervention and Iran's intervention in trying to broker a peace here in Syria, with them aligning themselves with President Bashar al-Assad, and that's not the point. The point is that we have regional powers who are trying to act against terror. And Washington does not want to end terror. I mean, if anything, they have worked with terrorists and for terror in Syria and in Iraq. And what they're trying to do is just basically use, the excuse of counterterrorism to play regime change. That's what they've been doing in both Iraq and Syria, by the way. The problem is President Bashar al-Assad has proven more resilient than firstly anticipated, and that's their problem. And so they're trying to, basically sell again this narrative that they are, fighting for democracy, that they're trying to abide by international law and trying to restore peace in Syria, when really, in the first place, all they have done systematically over the past few years is make the situation worse and create tensions within society by breaking up Syria from within by playing ethnic group and religious group against one another. That's what they have been doing. And I think that the only players right now who are trying to bring back some level of balance are Russia and Iran. And I'm sorry if Greg disagree with that. But you can't deny the fact that Syria is still a sovereign state and should remain a sovereign state, because America does not have a say in Syrian affairs, whether it likes it or not. That's the reality of living in a world where international law actually are worth the paper they're written on.
Okay, that was directed to you, Greg, so please pick it up and return. Go ahead.
Sure. The U.S. may not have a say in Syrian affairs if it's not on its own business massacring 300,000 individuals during a conflict that didn't start with American intervention. If we go back to 2011, we had posters and placards met with AK-47s. When the rebels took up arms, they were met with bombs. When they decided to arm themselves with artillery, they were met with chemical weapons. Up until the Assad regime started to use weapons of mass destruction against its own people, there was no call for American intervention. And only when the ISIS regime came out of the ability for Assad to not even manage his own conflict did the U.S. have to intervene. Not because of Syrian interests, but because American interests were at stake. And now when and if I could just finish this point, now when we look at the different five sides of who's fighting in Syria, we see that Assad, a brutal dictator supported by the Russian regime that's no liberal democracy in and of itself, is only being propped up by Putin because of Russian strategic interests being at play. We saw Jaish al-Islam, which was a coalition of three groups, going towards the Latakia region, where Russia has its only naval base on the Mediterranean Sea. And only when that base was under threat back in June did we see Russia preparing for an intervention. It wasn't because they want to stop terror organizations in Syria, it's because they want to preserve themselves in their own interests.
Well, that's the Western narrative, and that's what you hear over and over again. I think that's completely hollow there. If I can go to Professor Morandi, there's a lot of other reasons why Russia would go there. First of all, it was invited there under international law. The United States and its allies are bombing Syria against international law, and plus Russia has its own security issues when it comes to Sunni jihadists. It's called Chechnya and it's called the Caucasus, and it's really close by. So those are imperatives as well. So if I can stay with you, Professor Morandi, in Tehran, I mean, the problem is for me is that the Obama administration and many of its members have said it's all but a failure, this Syria policy, but the Pentagon just keeps sending arms to these same groups that we know that are tied to Al-Qaeda and other groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And we all know where ISIS came from because of failed invasion and occupation of Iran. Okay, I'm sorry, of Iraq after the 2003 invasion here. I mean, my point is here, where's the policy adjustment here? Because they just keep repeating the same thing, and it has given no positive results for anyone on the ground. Go ahead.
Well, despite the fact that Obama has been opposed to some of the policies that he's been pursuing and his administration has been pursuing, which is rather odd in itself. Yeah. He has shown to be deferential to neocons and those who have more extremist views, despite the fact that neocons are officially discredited in the United States. But unfortunately, many people in the U.S. political establishment, despite being opposed to neocons. They really are neocons in how they believe. It's sort of like Wahhabism. Unfortunately, there are Muslims who dislike Wahhabism, but when you speak to them, they are Wahhabi in ideology. So the U.S. president has pursued a policy in Syria which has led to genocide and destruction. And if anyone's guilty, it is the President of the United States, more than the Syrian president or more than many other world leaders. We have to remember that the former head of the Defense Intelligence Agency of the Pentagon, General Flynn, himself admitted that in 2012 the United States took a willful decision to support the extremists. Who were the extremists? They were Al-Qaeda at that time, the same people who carried out 9/11 or 7/7 in England. This is something that perhaps a year ago, if anyone had said this on television, they would have been called a conspiracy theorist.
Right.
But this is the person who was in charge of U.S. military intelligence. So the role of the United States cannot be denied. And even from the very start in Syria, despite the fact that the Syrian government made many mistakes, the slaughter that took place in Cairo against demonstrators, which was much more extensive, and the United States did nothing about that. What the Turkish government is doing against its own civilians and bombing them is not protested in Europe, and the Americans do not protest it. And even the Arab League mission that was sent by Qatar and Saudi Arabia, they did not draw the conclusions that the Western media and Western governments and the Saudis and the Qataris were pursuing. And that's why the mission was abandoned and discredited. But the reality is that the Iranians and others supported the Kofi Annan plan for free and fair elections and international monitors, but the Americans and the Turks
Professor
and others,
Morandi,
they
let me
didn't
jump in
want
here.
this to happen because they thought Assad would win.
We're going to go for a short break here, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Syria. Stay with RT. Okay, I want to go back to Philadelphia in the interest of fairness. Go ahead, Greg. I want you to be able to reply to some of the things we heard just before we went to the break. Go ahead.
Sure. So we had a significant broadside launched against U.S. policy and its allies in the Middle East, and I'd just like to respond point by point. First of all, on the alleged collaboration between Al-Qaeda and the United States. This is absolutely absurd. If we should look at any collaboration, it should be between Iran and Al-Qaeda, considering the fact that Tehran hosted Al-Qaeda refugees from Afghanistan 12 years up to the extent after 9/11. And if we want to look even further at the allegation of the U.S. collaborating with its allies in a genocide against Syria and Iraq, the U.S. has never struck any Syrian government targets. It's actually only going after terrorist organizations like ISIS and the Khorasan group that are affiliated with Al-Qaeda, including the Al-Nusra Front. I do agree with one thing, which is the innocent slaughter of the Kurds by the Turkish government. And I think that U.S. policy reflects this nuance in the fact that the main actor that the United States is supporting now is the YPG, or the Kurdish separatist group from Syria. So there are mistakes in policy that have been made over the past few years, but these mistakes are wholly untrue when they come to the allegations led by the professor who just spoke. And in addition to that, if we could just look at the recalibrating of U.S. policy, I have to go back to my original point. This is not one conflict of Syria as a sovereign actor against other individuals who are basically uprising against the Syrian government. This is the Kurds against the Turks. This is moderate Sunnis against ISIS. This is extremist Sunnis against the Assad regime, where the Russians are active right now. This is moderate Sunnis and moderate Syrian minority groups in the Golan Heights fighting against the Syrians there. It's many different conflicts.
But if we didn't have an administration that has this constant attitude of somebody has to go, Gaddafi has to go, Assad has to go, that opens up an entire realm of where you allow these conflicts to fester all of the time. You know the history of the region here. I'd like to go to Catherine here. I have to disagree with Greg here. I mean, the U.S. bombing campaign hasn't been killing terrorists. Not really. It's been destroying the infrastructure of the state of Syria. This is part of American foreign policy, is to destroy the state of Syria so there is no regime. And this is something that Russia has come in at the request of the Damascus government. I don't care if you like Assad or not. It is so immaterial here. It's talking about sovereignty and international law. Go ahead, Catherine, jump in.
No, I agree with everything that you said, and I think that's the problem. I think that Washington is looking at the conflict, from a very myopic perspective, and all they see is what they want in the region. And if I can go back very quickly to Greg's comment on dictatorship, I would like to say that Washington is allied to the worst dictatorship in the world, which is Saudi Arabia, and I don't think that they have any problem with them waging war in Yemen, by the way, where thousands and millions of people are suffering under bombing. So if you really want to compare, war crimes, you could maybe start there, because that's the first point. The second point, we need to stop understanding this Syrian war as a war against terror. I mean, when it comes to Washington, all they want is to have a regime change. And all they're targeting, as you said, they are trying to destroy Damascus government and Syria's ability to have functional institution. And that's a crime in itself, because if, again, I'm going back to international law, but if we do respect this, and if we pretend and claim to live in a world where we do want to abide by democratic standards, you cannot do this. You cannot call yourself a democracy and act like a colonial power. You cannot bomb a foreign state and claim that you are not an imperial power. That's the problem with America right now, is that they are trying again to have this propaganda and sell themselves as if they were this, brandishing the torch of freedom, when everything that they do and everything that they say, in foreign policy is contradicting this, this narrative. And I think that we need to wake up to this reality where, for now, I mean, the way I'm looking at it, and of course Washington would disagree and does not like what it sees right now, is that the only two powers playing by the rules, again, are Iran and Russia. And because they understand that you cannot impose political will onto people, what you need to do is to have some level of cooperation. And yes, of course, they are looking for the interest, because Russia wants what's good for Russia, but Russia doesn't do what's good for Russia to the detriment of other people's stability, in the region, because they understand that it will come back to haunt them. But America thinks that on the other side of the Atlantic,
Peter,
nothing can touch them, and that's the problem.
Go ahead, Greg, jump in, ask a question. Go ahead.
If the U.S.'s goal is to remove the Assad regime, how come they haven't struck any Syrian army or government targets?
May I respond to that?
Go ahead, please do.
Well, the United States has helped create a civil war in Syria. They've destroyed most of the country. The U.S. president is deeply involved in the slaughter of innocent Syrians. Those of us who've been talking about Syria from the very beginning were predicting that these extremist groups were going to dominate. We were saying this in 2011. And in fact, history has shown.
But you haven't answered my question.
Well, no, I can
Libyan,
give the question answer is really.
In fact, besides the fact that the United States has bombed electrical power plants near Halab or Aleppo, which has nothing to do with military targets, and it provided electricity to the city. The United States has destroyed the country. So they've done it through extremist organizations that they've been funding. And to say that the Americans were not involved with extremists goes against what former General Flynn has been saying, who was the head of intelligence in the Pentagon. I'm surprised that in the United States there is no discussion about what he has said, the person who was in charge of intelligence. So the United States is deeply involved, and Al-Qaeda from Libya helped create the Free Syrian Army and the extremists in 2011 and 12. And the Americans in 2012 said that these extremist groups are the groups that are dominating the battles in Syria, and they said that our allies are supporting them.
I'd like to just take a point really quick just to address that.
And that is there are no moderates. If Greg believes that the U.S. Vice President knows what he's talking about, the U.S. Vice President last October said there are no moderates in Syria. Yet after the Russians begin bombing, and after 2 weeks they did more than what the Americans did in over a year, after the Russians began bombing, suddenly they were screaming that they're bombing the moderates. Well, there were no moderates up to now.
Okay, but Greg, I think the answer to your question is the answer to your question is that the United States is technically not at war with Syria, and so what it does is just undermine the regime in Syria. That's a different matter, I suppose. And they have these little smoke and mirrors with their laws and whatnot. This is an extension of this and that, and it's all smoke and mirrors. No, they don't want to be seen as doing that, but they do want to see him go, and we see that repeatedly. If I can go with Greg here still, okay, since I knew this was going to happen, and I want to be respectful towards you. The Russians have suggested in spring of next year that there should be elections. Would you support that in Syria?
I would support a free and fair and democratic election, but I don't see how you can have that when you have all these groups that are against democracy, including the Syrian regime.
Well, I mean, maybe
if we just do a real quick analysis.
Why don't they just be forced out of the country or given a deadline? If you don't leave the country in the next 48 hours, you're a fair target for destruction. Go back to where you came from. Go back to Saudi Arabia. Go back to Qatar, wherever you're from. Go away, and there will be a democratic election. And I think I know how the outcome would be, and I think Assad and his people would win. That's why they don't want an election. Go ahead, Greg.
Right.
Good. Go ahead.
The policy right now of the Syrian government is just what you said, leave our country. But the thing is that most of the people who are fighting against Assad aren't coming from foreign fighters, because ISIS isn't mainly involved in a fight against Assad except in Aleppo. It's Syrian versus jihadist fighting. And I would be fine with that policy of asking non-Syrians to leave Syria. But when we look at Russian Defense Ministry statistics and statements from President Putin himself, we see that over 80% of the bombings that are done by Russian forces in Syria are not against ISIS. They're not against the principal enemy of this Western Russian alliance.
They're against terrorists. They're against Al-Qaeda.
They are against groups.
Okay, you know, let me.
It's easy just to say Al-Qaeda and then have like a broad brush.
Let's be clear here that it's not hard to find European Union officials and independent member countries of the European Union, including plus Russia, naming the number of their citizens that have gone to Syria to fight jihad there. It is thousands and thousands of them. So, Greg, you know, this is very international. They want a part of ISIS, part of Al-Qaeda. This is the danger. And we're all should be all be. Go ahead, jump in there. Go ahead, Mohammed. Go ahead.
Well, I think one of the amazing things that we've been seeing over the past couple of years is that how in the Western media and among Western people in Western think tanks and in governments that Al-Qaeda is they're trying to make it seem as if Al-Qaeda is somehow moderate. Al-Qaeda is the same organization that, according to the Americans, carried out 9/11.
I never ever said that. You can't say that on what I've said.
It is because of Al-Qaeda that they invaded Afghanistan. The Nusra Front is Al-Qaeda.
Yes.
Jund al-Sham is Al-Qaeda, an Al-Qaeda affiliate. These are the two key organizations. ISIL is the third, which was also Al-Qaeda. And then the so-called moderates are working in alliance with Al-Qaeda. The United States invaded Iraq for two reasons. One was because of chemical weapons, which didn't exist, and the second was because they accused Saddam Hussein of being in dialogue with Al-Qaeda. So back then you would destroy a country because of the name Al-Qaeda, and now you work with Al-Qaeda. This is the worst type of hypocrisy.
It's very easy to cast the fog of war here,
Mohammed, and the Israeli regime, which also supports the Nusra Front.
Let me jump in.
No position.
Let me jump in here,
gentlemen.
Gentlemen, let's be respectful of the lady. The last 25 seconds goes to our guest in Brighton. Go ahead, dear.
Well, I'd just like to note that, yes, indeed. I mean, when it comes to Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and the rest of it, I mean, what I call Wahhabi radicals, we all know that the U.S. have a hand in them, in helping them, propping them, and funding them. And I would like to go back to what Hillary Clinton said, when she admitted to the creation of Al-Qaeda and saying that it kind of backfired, against Washington. And yes, it did. But then again, Washington is time and time again using the same tactic, the same techniques, where it's using terror to frame, its imperial wars in the Middle East, trying to play let's change a leader. And that's what they've been doing. The problem is the Middle East is fighting back. And
Catherine, I'm sorry to jump in here. We've run out of time. We've run out of time. Many thanks to my guests in Tehran, Brighton, and in Philadelphia. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, Crosstalk rules.
I love you.